There is a particular kind of quiet that arrives just before sleep. Not the quiet of an empty room or the silence after a door closes. It is something different, something that happens inside the body almost without your noticing. A gradual softening, a slow reduction in the effort it takes just to exist in the world. Scientists who study the sleeping brain have described it as a kind of gentle unwinding, the way a fist might open in warm water finger by finger without any decision being made. The body begins this process on its own, long before the mind gives any instruction. And if you are still enough, if the room is dark enough, you can sometimes feel it beginning. A small heaviness behind the eyes, a loosening somewhere along the shoulders, a breath that arrives a little more slowly than the one before it. This is where we are right now, somewhere between one day and the next. In the neuroscience of sleep, this particular threshold has a name. Researchers call it hypnagogia, the transitional state between wakefulness and sleep when the brain begins to shift from its busy beta waves into something gentler, something slower. The neural activity that has been running your thoughts, your plans, your small anxieties about tomorrow, it begins very gradually to change its rhythm. Alpha waves move in like a tide coming in over a shore. And in that shifting, something opens up. The mind becomes softer around its edges, more permeable somehow, more willing to receive. It is a state that humans have been entering every single night for as long as there have been humans. And yet it remains, even now, one of the quieter mysteries in all of sleep science. Researchers understand quite a lot about what happens after sleep begins, about the deep rhythms of slow-wave sleep, about the flickering strangeness of dreaming. But this threshold, this soft, tender corridor between being awake and being asleep, still holds a kind of gentleness that resists full explanation. It seems to be different for everyone, and yet it finds everyone eventually in its own time. Tonight, that corridor is where we will stay for a while. There is no rush to move through it quickly. The reason we are here tonight in this particular space has to do with something ancient and green and growing. It has to do with plants, not in any complicated way, not in the way of laboratories and clinical trials and sterile white rooms, though some of that is woven in gently as we go. More in the way of something simpler, the way certain plants seem to have understood, long before we arrived with our instruments and our curiosity, something about rest, something about the body's need to let go, something about the relationship between the living world and the act of sleep. Plants and sleep have been companions for a very long time. Before there were cities, before there was writing, before there was almost anything we would recognize as civilization, people were already gathering certain leaves, certain roots, certain flowers, and bringing them close when the night came. They dried them, steeped them in warm water, tucked them into the linens where they slept. They did not have the language we use. Now they could not have told you about gamma-aminobutyric acid, or about benzodiazepine receptors, or about the complex chemistry that moves between a plant and a human nervous system. But they noticed something. They noticed that certain plants changed the quality of the night, made the descent into sleep a little softer, made the hours between dark and dawn feel less like a crossing and more like a rest. That noticing is what we are following tonight. The science of it has grown more detailed over time, as science does. We now know, for instance, that many of the plants humans have used for thousands of years actually do contain specific compounds that interact with the brain's own systems for regulating calm and rest. The relationship is not imagined. It is not simply ritual or belief, though ritual and belief have their own gentle power. The chemistry is real. The receptors are there quietly waiting. And the plants, in their unhurried way, have been producing these compounds for reasons entirely their own reasons that have nothing to do with human sleep, and yet fit so precisely into the architecture of human sleep that it feels sometimes like a kind of quiet coincidence. Scientists suggest that many of these compounds evolved as defensive ways for plants to protect themselves from insects, from microbes, from the pressures of the living world. And yet somewhere in that long history of chemistry and evolution, something happened. The molecules that plants made for their own purposes turned out to fit almost perfectly into spaces the human brain had made for entirely different reasons. Two separate stories running in parallel for millions of years, and then at some point, gently meeting. There is something about that which is worth sitting with for a moment. Not thinking about just sitting with. The world is full of these quiet fittings, these unplanned connections between things that were never by any logic supposed to find each other. And yet here they are, a compound in a lavender flower and a receptor deep inside a human brain. A molecule released by a root in the soil and a pathway in the nervous system that recognizes it somehow as something familiar. Something that says, in whatever language the body uses for these things, yes, this, rest now. Outside, wherever you are tonight, somewhere there is a garden, or a meadow, or a hillside, or a crack between two pieces of pavement, where something small and green has decided to grow. And in that growing in the quiet chemistry of photosynthesis and cell division, and the slow production of compounds too small to see something is happening that will eventually, in ways both direct and indirect, make its way toward the long human conversation about sleep. The plants are not doing this for us. They are not thinking of us at all. But the connection is there running quietly in the background as it has been for a very long time. Tonight, we will follow that connection slowly, without any need to arrive anywhere specific. We will move through the world of medicinal plants, the way you might walk through a garden in the late evening, pausing here, lingering there, letting the light and the fragrance and the soft sounds of the place settle into you, rather than the other way around. There is nothing to remember, nothing to hold on to, only a slow drift through real things, through science that is gentle, through stories that are old, through a world that has always been, in its quiet way, attending to the matter of rest. The body already knows how to do this. It has been doing it every night of your life, long before you were aware enough to think about it. What the plants offer, what the science is slowly learning to explain, is simply a kind of accompaniment, a softening of the path, a way of making the descent a little less effortless, a little more held. And the descent has already begun. If you notice your breathing, you may find it has already slowed just slightly from what it was before. That is the body doing what it does, moving toward the threshold in its own time. The thoughts that were present a few moments ago, they are still there perhaps, but they may feel a little further away, a little less urgent. That too is the body. That too is the brain shifting its rhythm-making room. We will stay in that room for a while tonight, moving slowly through the green world, through its chemistry and its long history, through the soft science of rest, and the even softer mystery of why certain living things seem to know something about the stillness that human beings spend so much of their waking lives trying to find. And somewhere along the way, if sleep finds you before we reach the end, that is not a failure of attention. That is in fact exactly the point. The plants have been patient for thousands of years. They will be here whenever you come back. There is something that happens in a garden after the sun goes down. Not the dramatic kind of change, not the sudden shift of colors or the cooling of air that you can feel against your skin. Something quieter than that. Something that most people never think about because most people are inside by then, moving through their evening routines, not thinking about what is happening just beyond the window in the dark. Plants, it turns out, do not simply rest at night. Some of them become more chemically active in the hours after sunset than at any other time of the day. Certain species, lavender chamomile, valerian passionflower, many of the plants that humans have turned to for sleep and calm across centuries show measurable increases in the production of their most potent compounds during the nighttime hours. Essential oils concentrate more fully in the leaves and flowers. Volatile molecules accumulate. Some researchers who study plant chemistry describe a kind of metabolic rhythm in these plants that is not unlike the rhythm of the human body itself. A daily cycle of activity and rest, production and release that follows the turning of the earth with a precision that still quietly astonishes those who study it. Scientists call this the circadian rhythm of secondary metabolism. It is the plant's internal clock, running on a cycle of roughly 24 hours, adjusting what it makes and when it releases it based on signals from light temperature and the slow biological machinery of its own tissues. And what is interesting, what researchers have been slowly piecing together over decades is that the timing of this chemical activity in plants does not always coincide with what seems most logical. You might expect a plant to concentrate its most aromatic compounds in the middle of the day when pollinators are active and the air is warm. But many medicinal plants follow a different pattern. They save something for the dark. It seems that the relationship between these plants and the nighttime is older than we know how to measure. For thousands of years, the people who gathered herbs and roots and flowers understood intuitively that the time of harvest mattered. Traditional herbalists in many cultures would collect certain plants at dusk or just before dawn or by moonlight, not because of any particular mysticism, though the language they used sometimes sounded that way, but because they had observed over many generations that these timings affected the potency of what they gathered. What they were doing without the language of biochemistry was following the plant's own clock. They were working in rhythm with something they did not fully understand but had learned to respect. What we understand now, looking back through that long history with the tools of modern science, is that they were right. The compounds do concentrate differently depending on when you harvest. The oils are richer, the volatile molecules are more abundant. The chemistry of the plant at midnight is genuinely different from its chemistry at noon in ways that matter, ways that affect how the plant interacts with the human body, with human sleep, with human calm. And yet there is still so much about this that remains quietly uncertain. What we understand so far suggests that the production of these sleep-associated compounds, the terpenes, the flavonoids, the alkaloids that give these plants their effects, is not random. It is regulated, it is timed. But the full picture of why certain plants develop these compounds in the first place, and why their rhythm seems to align so closely with the rhythm of human rest, is not yet completely known. Some scientists believe it is coincidence in the sense that evolutionary biology understands coincidence, that the compounds served other purposes, entirely protecting the plant from insects or fungi or the stress of the night, and their effect on human sleep is simply a kind of accidental resonance, a biological conversation that nobody planned. Others are less certain that it is so simple. There is a field of research still in its early stages that looks at what is sometimes called ecological synchrony, the way living systems that share an environment for long enough begin to influence one another's rhythms. Bees and flowers, fungi and tree roots, the timing of a forest's chemical activity, and the nocturnal habits of the animals that move through it. The idea is not mystical, it is mechanical in the way that evolution is mechanical, but the patterns it produces can look from the outside like something more intentional than chance, like a kind of quiet coordination happening below the level of consciousness, below the level of decision, in the deep and patient language of chemistry and time. The plants that humans have used for sleep across the longest arc of history are almost all plants that become chemically richest in the dark. You might sit with that for a moment and let it settle, not as a mystery to solve, but as a fact to rest beside. The valerian root that has been used to ease sleeplessness since the time of ancient Greece. The lavender that grew along Mediterranean hillsides and was pressed into sachets and pillow stuffing and warm baths for centuries before anyone could explain why it worked. The chamomile that spread across every temperate continent and was gathered by people who had no contact with each other but arrived at the same quiet understanding that this small, unassuming flower had something to offer the tired body at the end of a long day, all of them producing more of their most calming chemistry as the night deepens. There is something almost companionable about that if you allow yourself to feel it. The idea that while you are moving towards sleep, the plants in the world outside are also moving into their own kind of fullness, that the chemistry of rest is not something you have to manufacture entirely on your own, that it exists in the world around you, in the leaves and roots and flowers that have been quietly keeping rhythm with the dark for far longer than you or anyone you know has been alive. Researchers who study sleep and aromatic compounds have found something interesting about how the human body receives these plant chemicals. It is not only through active use through teas and tinctures and essential oils diffused into a room. The effect begins even earlier, even more passively, in the simple fact of breathing. Certain volatile compounds released by medicinal plants are small enough to cross the blood-brain barrier. When inhaled, they enter the body through the lungs and make their way quietly and quickly into the central nervous system, where they interact with the same receptor systems that regulate relaxation and sleep. The body does not resist them. They fit in some cases with a precision that surprises researchers into spaces in the brain that seem designed to receive exactly this kind of molecular signal. Some scientists suggest that this biological compatibility between plant compounds and human neurochemistry is not accidental in the ordinary sense, that the long history of coevolution between humans and the plant world has left traces in both directions. The plants have shaped their chemistry partly in response to the animals that consumed them, and the animals, humans among them, have developed receptor systems that respond to the plants they lived among. It is a conversation conducted not in words or sounds, but in molecules and receptors, in the slow biological grammar of millions of years of shared time on the same earth. What that means on a night like this one is something quieter and more personal. It means that when you breathe slowly in a room where lavender is present, or hold a warm cup of chamomile between your hands, or simply step outside into a garden after dark and breathe what is there, something is happening that is older than any word for it. Not magic, not coincidence. Something between the two, perhaps in the place where science has not yet fully arrived, but is making its way carefully, one study at a time. The plants have been waiting in the dark for a very long time, and what they have accumulated there in their leaves and roots and flowers in the patient chemistry of their nighttime hours carries something the human nervous system has always known how to receive. You do not have to understand it fully to feel it begin. Dui Jaila, Part 3 Tiep, Noitun Hien Tuhin, and Plants Waiting in the Dark, Vamo Vau the Gioi, Qua Lavender ki Uchku Giach, Va Koche Gaba. Of all the plants that have accompanied human sleep across the centuries, lavender may be the one that has traveled the farthest, not in distance, but in time. It grows wild along the rocky hillsides of the Mediterranean, in thin soil, in full sun, in the kind of spare and unhurried landscape that does not seem to ask much of anything that lives there. The flowers are small. The color is that particular shade of violet blue that has no better name than the plant itself. And the scent, that is where the story really begins, because the scent of lavender is one of the most studied fragrances in the history of plant science. And what researchers have found when they look closely at what it does to the human brain is genuinely remarkable in the quietest possible way. The primary compound responsible for lavender's effect on the nervous system is called linalool. It is a terpene alcohol, a class of molecule that plants produce in abundance for a variety of reasons, most of which have nothing to do with human beings at all. Linalool is part of lavender's defense system, its communication network, its way of interacting with the world of insects and microbes that surrounds it. But when it enters the human body, through the lungs, through the skin, through the simple act of being near a flowering lavender plant on a warm evening, it does something unexpected. It interacts with the gamma-aminobutyric acid receptor system in the brain, the same receptor system that the body uses to regulate its own transition into calm. Gamma-aminobutyric acid is the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. When it binds to its receptors, it reduces the firing rate of neurons, it turns down the volume in a sense of neural activity. It is what allows the nervous system to shift from the heightened alertness of a busy day into the softer, quieter state that precedes sleep. And what research suggests about linalool is that it appears to enhance this process not by flooding the system or forcing a change, but by gently supporting what the brain is already trying to do. Scientists have found that inhaling linalool can increase the production of gamma-aminobutyric acid activity in ways that parallel, in a mild and natural form, what certain pharmaceutical sleep aids attempt to achieve through more direct chemical means. The difference some researchers note is in the gentleness of the effect. Linalool does not override the nervous system. It does not push. It seems instead to simply make it slightly easier for the brain to do what it was already inclined to do, to slow, to settle, to soften at the edges. There is something worth noticing in that distinction. So much of what modern life offers for sleep is about force, about chemical intervention, strong enough to override the brain's own hesitations. But lavender and linalool specifically seems to work by a different logic, a logic of support rather than override, of accompanying rather than compelling. Researchers who study plant-based compounds and sleep often use the word modulation, the idea that these molecules adjust the brain's existing systems rather than replacing them. It is a subtle difference in mechanism, but it produces a different quality of experience, something closer to the feeling of being gently held than of being suddenly switched off. What makes this even more interesting is that the effect of lavender on the brain is not limited to linalool's direct chemical action. There is a second layer, and it runs deeper into the oldest parts of the brain, into the architecture of memory itself. The olfactory system, the system of smell, is neurologically unique in the human brain. Most sensory information takes an indirect route to the limbic system, the emotional and memory center. It passes through a relay station, a kind of sorting office in the brain called the thalamus, before it reaches the structures that process emotion and memory. But smell is different. Olfactory signals travel directly from the nose to the amygdala and the hippocampus, the structures most closely associated with emotional memory, without passing through the thalamus at all. There is no intermediary, no delay, no filtering. This is why a smell can reach you in a way that a sound or an image sometimes cannot. Why the scent of something from your childhood can arrive in the present moment with a fullness that feels almost physical, not just a memory of a place, but the feeling of being inside it. Researchers call this the Proust phenomenon, after the French novelist who described it with unusual precision, the way a single smell can unfold an entire world of memory and feeling without any act of will, without any effort of recollection, simply by arriving. And lavender, for many people, carries exactly that kind of layered weight. It has been present in human spaces for so long, in sachets, tucked inside pillowcases, in bathwater, in the folds of clean linen, in the gardens outside bedroom windows, that for a great many people, it has become neurologically associated with rest itself, with safety, with the specific quality of stillness that belongs to bedtime. When the brain encounters that scent in the evening, it does not only receive linalool's chemical signal, it also receives a memory, or more precisely, it receives the emotional texture of many memories compressed and carried in a single molecule, arriving without announcement in the oldest and most direct pathways of the brain. Scientists who study conditioned relaxation responses have found that repeated associations between a particular scent and a state of calm can over time deepen and reinforce each other. The more often you encounter lavender in the context of rest, the more efficiently your nervous system begins to recognize it as a signal for rest. The response becomes, in a sense, learned, not in the conscious way that you learn a fact or a skill, but in the quiet cellular way that the body learns anything it repeats often enough. A kind of knowledge that lives below thought. There are still questions here that science has not fully answered. Researchers are still working to understand precisely how much of lavender's sleep-promoting effect comes from linalool's direct action on gamma-aminobutyric acid receptors, and how much comes from the conditioned memory pathways, and how much perhaps from the simple fact that the smell of it asks something of you very gently, without words, that it creates a momentary interruption in whatever the mind was doing and offers instead a small and familiar invitation towards stillness. The full picture, as is often the case with the most interesting questions in neuroscience, is not yet completely known. What does seem clear is that the relationship between lavender and human sleep is not a simple one. It is layered, it is historical, it is partly chemical and partly mnemonic, and partly something that happens in the quiet space between the two, in the place where biology and experience have been slowly interweaving for longer than any of us have been alive. The plant itself has not changed much in all that time. It still grows in thin soil, in full sun, on rocky hillsides around the Mediterranean, and now in gardens and fields on nearly every temperate continent. It still produces its linalool in the hours when the air cools, in the language of chemistry that it developed long before any human walked past it and stopped for a reason they could not quite explain, to breathe it in. It still carries in its small violet flowers a molecule that fits into the human brain with a precision that continues to quietly astonish the people who study it. And perhaps that is enough to hold for a while the image of something so small carrying something so old. A plant that has been accompanying human rest across such a vast stretch of time that its chemistry and our neurology have in some measurable way learned the shape of each other. Scent is the sense most connected to what we have already felt, and what many of us have already felt in the presence of lavender is something close to the permission to let the day go. Not because the day was bad or good, simply because it is ending. Because something in the air, something without a word for itself, is quietly saying, You can set it down now. It will still be there, but for now, you do not need to carry it. The roots of valerian growing in the dark soil of meadows and riverbanks have been carrying a different kind of quiet chemistry, older perhaps, and stranger, and still not entirely understood. And that is where the story drifts softly from here. Some knowledge arrives slowly, not because it is difficult exactly, but because it belongs to a different kind of time than the time we usually move through. The kind of knowledge that accumulates not in laboratories or libraries, but in the hands of people who worked with the same plants across generation after generation, in the same soil, in the same seasons, in the same quiet hours before sleep. Knowledge that was never written down in the beginning, because it did not need to be. It was simply lived. Valerian root is one of the oldest sleep remedies that human beings have recorded. The ancient Greeks knew it. The physician Galen, writing in the 2nd century, described it as a treatment for insomnia and nervous complaints, though he called it by a different name, and his understanding of why it worked would be unrecognizable to a modern pharmacologist. The ancient Romans used it. Medieval European herbalists considered it among their most reliable remedies, listing it in manuscripts alongside detailed instructions for when to harvest, how to dry it, how long to store it before its potency began to fade. For roughly 2,000 years across cultures that had almost nothing else in common, people reached for this particular root when sleep would not come. That kind of consensus sustained across that span of time is not nothing. It does not prove anything in the scientific sense. Researchers are careful about that. But it does suggest something worth paying attention to. When a remedy survives 2,000 years of continuous use across different continents and different medical traditions and different ideas about how the human body works, something in it is usually doing something real. The long history of valerian is not the kind of story that accumulates around a placebo. It is the kind of story that accumulates around a plant that genuinely in some way that takes a long time to fully understand works. Modern science has been trying to explain why for several decades now, and the answer it has arrived at is in certain ways still incomplete. What researchers have found is that valerian root contains a complex mixture of compounds, among them valerianic acid, a substance that appears to interact with the gamma-aminobutyric acid receptor system in the brain. Gamma-aminobutyric acid is the nervous system's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. When it binds to its receptors, it quiets neural activity. It slows the firing of neurons. It creates, in the language of neuroscience, a state of reduced excitability, which in the language of ordinary experience feels like the particular kind of softening that happens in the body and mind when anxiety begins to release its grip. Valerianic acid appears to inhibit the enzyme that breaks gamma-aminobutyric acid down. In doing so, it allows the neurotransmitter to remain active longer, to bind more fully, to do its quieting work more completely than it might otherwise. Some scientists describe this mechanism as gentle, not the aggressive suppression of a pharmaceutical sedative, which forces the nervous system into a state it has not chosen, but something more like a removal of interference. Like clearing away what was preventing rest, rather than imposing rest from the outside. There is a difference, and it is a meaningful one. The body knows how to sleep. It has been sleeping for as long as it has existed longer, if you trace the evolutionary line back far enough, because the biological mechanisms of sleep are ancient in ways that go well beyond our species. What disrupts sleep most of the time is not an absence of the biological capacity for rest. It is the presence of something that gets in the way, the accumulated tension of a long day, the nervous system still running at the frequency of activity long after the activity has stopped. the mind reviewing what happened and rehearsing what might happen in that particular loop of low-level alertness that does not serve any obvious purpose in the dark and quiet of a bedroom, but continues anyway because the nervous system has not yet received a clear enough signal that it can stop. Valerian, it seems, helps deliver that signal, not forcefully, not by overriding what the nervous system is doing, but by modifying very gently the chemical environment in which the nervous system is operating, reducing the rate at which its calming chemistry breaks down, allowing the brain's own quieting mechanisms to become slightly more effective than they were a moment before. What happens then is not sleep imposed from outside. It is sleep that the body finds its own way into along a path that has been made a little easier. Researchers who study this sometimes note that Valerian's effects take time to accumulate. Unlike a pharmaceutical sedative, which produces a measurable change in brain activity within an hour or less, Valerian used consistently over days and weeks tends to show its strongest effects gradually. The nervous system seems to respond to it the way it responds to other slow, cumulative things, the way the body responds to regular gentle exercise or to a gradual change in diet, or to the slow development of a new habit of calm. Not dramatically, not immediately, but in a direction that continues quietly as long as the thing continues. There is something in that which feels related to the plant itself. Valerian is not a fast-growing plant. It takes its time. The roots, which are the part used medicinally, develop over a period of years before they are considered mature enough to harvest. The plant puts down its chemistry, slowly building it layer by layer in the soil in the dark, far from where it can be seen. And then when the root is finally lifted and dried and prepared, what comes out of it is the result of all that slow accumulation years of patient work happening quietly underground. There is a poetic symmetry there, even if you are the kind of person who prefers not to rely on poetry. The science of Valerian is also in some ways a story about patience, about understanding arriving in its own time rather than on demand. For most of the 2,000 years that people used this plant, they had no idea why it worked. They knew that it did, or rather, they trusted that it did, based on the evidence of their own experience and the inherited testimony of everyone who had come before them. They worked with incomplete knowledge, the way most people have always worked with most things, and they were largely correct. The mechanism they could not name was real. The effect they could not explain was happening. What we understand now, looking back through that long corridor of time, is that the knowledge was always partially there, distributed across centuries of use, encoded in practice, rather than in explanation, waiting for the moment when science would arrive with the tools to find what had been present all along. Some scientists suggest that this gap between practice and explanation, between knowing that something works and understanding why, is more common in the history of medicine than we tend to acknowledge. The body often responds to things before the mind has finished explaining them. Plants contain compounds that fit into human receptor systems with a precision that suggests a much longer conversation between our biology and theirs than any of us will live to fully trace. And Valerian is, in a way, one of the clearest examples of that conversation. 2,000 years of use across cultures that had no contact with each other, arriving at the same quiet conclusion that this root, grown slowly in ordinary soil, had something to offer the human nervous system at the end of a long day. Not a cure for anything, not a dramatic intervention, just a gentle chemical assistance, modest and patient and reliable, that helped the body remember what it already knew how to do. There is something gently reassuring about that if you let it settle. The idea that rest has always been available, that the nervous system has always contained the capacity for it, that sometimes what is needed is not more effort in the direction of sleep, but simply a quieting of what was in the way, a removal very soft and very gradual of the interference between the tired body and the rest it has been moving toward all day. Valerian does not carry you into sleep. It simply clears a little space. And in that space, something that was already there, something the body has known how to do since long before anyone named it, long before anyone thought to study it or write it down or try to explain it, has a little more room to happen. That room in the hours before sleep is perhaps all that is ever really needed. And there are other plants that understand this too, in their own ways, through their own particular chemistry, each one approaching the same quiet outcome from a slightly different direction. One of them has a way of working that is so specific, so elegantly targeted, that when researchers first began to understand what it was doing at the molecular level, some of them found it difficult to believe that something so precise could have developed in the wild without anyone designing it. A small climbing plant, flowering in the late summer, that seems to know in the wordless way that plants know things exactly where, in the human brain, the interference tends to gather. Toin han thay ban jang yeo kau viet lai, part bon ko the ban moon mot fien ban kach, voi gok tiep kan kach. Nhao toi se viet part nam theo, dan I ja thong, nhat vengon nangu kwa, rekaiva, mang luoi mai korizalvi. Part bon ve Valerian, ja juoch hoan than, o tren. Nhung neu ban thuk, sumuon mot part bon kach, voi huong kach hai cho toi biet. Duoi jai la part 5, tiep noi tun hien tu fan ket kua. Part bon hin, an kai leon hobiet chin sach noi nau trong nau konangoi, sun hiu loan tikstu. Beneath every forest floor, there is a network. Not a visible one. Not something you would notice walking through. Not something that changes the appearance of the soil or the way the light falls through the trees. But it is there, nonetheless, running silently through the dark earth in filaments so fine that a single teaspoon of healthy forest soil can contain several kilometers of them laid end to end. A web of fungal threads, ancient and patient, connecting the roots of trees and plants across distances that the plants themselves could never reach alone. Scientists call this network the mycorrhizal network. Mycorrhiza, from the Greek words for fungus and root, describes the symbiotic relationship between certain fungi and the root systems of most of the plants on Earth. Roughly 90% of land plants participate in this relationship in some form. They have been doing so for approximately 450 million years, which means this partnership predates flowers, predates insects, predates almost everything we tend to think of when we picture a natural world. The network is not new. It is, in geological terms, one of the most enduring arrangements that life on this planet has ever produced. What moves through it is something that researchers are still in the process of understanding fully. Carbon, for one thing. Plants produce sugars through photosynthesis and share a portion of them with their fungal partners through the root connections, a kind of payment in the language of ecology for the services the fungi provide. In return, the fungi extend the plant's effective reach through the soil enormously, bringing back water and minerals, particularly phosphorus, that the plant's own roots could not access. It is a trade, a slow, continuous, wordless exchange of resources between organisms that have no nervous systems, no capacity for intention, no awareness of each other, in any sense that resembles awareness as we experience it. And yet the exchange is by any reasonable measure sophisticated. When a tree in a forest is damaged by drought, by insects, by disease, chemical signals move through the mycorrhizal network to neighboring plants. The neighboring plants in some studies appear to respond. They may increase their own production of defensive compounds. They may redirect resources. They may, in ways that researchers are still working to characterize, precisely prepare for a stress that has not yet reached them directly, but whose signal has arrived through the shared underground system. Some scientists describe this as a kind of distributed sensitivity, not intelligence in the way we use that word, but a responsiveness that spans the entire connected community of plants operating below any individual plant's surface in the patient grammar of chemistry and time. The word that sometimes appears in research describing this is communication. It is a word that scientists use carefully here because it carries implications that the data does not necessarily support, implications of intention, of meaning-making, of something resembling what we do when we speak to each other. The researchers who use it tend to qualify it quickly, noting that what moves through the network is chemical signals responding to chemical conditions, not messages composed by a sender for a receiver. And yet the qualification, however scientifically necessary, does not entirely dissolve the strangeness of what is being described. A signal moves through the earth. Another organism receives it. Something in that organism changes in response. Whatever we call it, something is happening. And among the plants connected through these networks are many of the plants that have been most valued across human history for their effects on the nervous system. Valerian grows in communities. Passionflower spreads in ways that suggest its root systems are in regular contact with the soil networks around them. Many of the medicinal herbs that produce calming compounds, the same volatile terpenes and flavonoids that interact with human receptor systems, are deeply embedded in the mycorrhizal communities of the ecosystems where they grow. Their chemistry does not develop in isolation. It develops in conversation, or whatever the wordless plant equivalent of conversation is, with the broader living system they inhabit. There is something that research on plant stress responses has revealed, which sits quietly at the edge of what we know and what we are still piecing together. When plants that produce calming aromatic compounds are grown in isolation, without access to mycorrhizal networks, some studies suggest their production of those compounds is lower than when they grow in connected communities. The chemistry seems to develop more fully in the presence of the network, as though the plant is in some biological sense responding to its context, as though what it produces is partly a function of where it is and who it is connected to and what signals are moving through the shared earth beneath it. Researchers are cautious about drawing strong conclusions from this. The mechanisms are complex and the data is still accumulating. But the general direction of the finding is consistent with a broader picture that plant biology has been painting for several decades now, that plants are not isolated chemical factories producing their compounds in a vacuum according to a fixed genetic program. They are responsive systems embedded in living networks, adjusting what they make and when they make it in response to conditions that extend far beyond their own individual roots and leaves. The lavender on a hillside in Provence is not just lavender, it is lavender in relationship with the soil, with the fungi threading through that soil with the other plants, whose root systems interweave with the particular combination of light and temperature and humidity and microbial life that makes that hillside what it is. Strip away those relationships, grow the same plant in sterile soil under controlled conditions, and you get something that is genetically identical but chemically different, a diminished version of what the plant becomes when it is allowed to be fully itself, in full connection with everything around it. This is in a way a thought that does not stay contained to plants. There is something in the research on social connection and human sleep that moves in a similar direction. Studies have found that people who report feeling strongly connected to others, to family, to community, to something larger than their individual daily experience, tend to sleep more deeply and wake less frequently than those who feel isolated. The nervous system, it appears, is not designed to rest in isolation either. It rests more fully when it feels held within something, when the signals moving through its own internal network carry a sense of safety that comes not just from the absence of threat, but from the presence of connection. The body is not so different from the forest floor, perhaps. Both are systems in which the quality of the network matters, in which the richness of what can be exchanged, the signals, the resources, the slow chemical conversations conducted in the dark shapes what becomes possible. And in both cases, the most important of those exchanges happen quietly below the surface, in ways that are not directly visible and not consciously directed, but are continuous and real, and in their cumulative effect, profound. Outside, in whatever dark is pressing against your window right now, roots are in contact with each other through threads you will never see. Chemical signals are moving through the soil at a pace that makes human patience look hurried, and the plants, whose compounds will find their way in one form or another into human hands and human cups and human evenings, those plants are doing their slow, connected underground work. It is a kind of intimacy, what happens in the soil. Not dramatic, not visible, just continuous, the way the most sustaining things tend to be. And when you consider how much of what supports a living system happens in exactly this way, quietly, invisibly through networks that were old before anything alive today existed, it becomes a little easier perhaps to trust that something similar might be happening in you right now, in the gradual quieting that the body moves toward when the day is done. There is chemistry in that quieting too. Particular molecules moving through particular systems, doing their particular work, some of it understood, some of it still being mapped, all of it happening whether or not there is a name for it yet. And some of what moves through you in these slower hours has been shaped in ways both direct and circuitous by what moves through the networks in the soil, by the compounds of plants that grew in connected communities, that were harvested and prepared and offered to the human nervous system as something it has always known, in some quiet cellular way, how to receive. The chamomile in a cup of evening tea has traveled a long way to reach you, not just across a kitchen, or across a supply chain, or across the distance between a field somewhere and the place where you are lying now. It has traveled across the mycorrhizal networks of wherever it grew, across the chemical conversations of its own community, across centuries of human use and decades of scientific inquiry. And it carries with it, in its particular molecular structure, a kind of information about rest, about the nervous system, about what happens in the body when a specific molecule finds a specific receptor, and the two fit together in the way that things fit together when they have been in relationship in one form or another for a very long time. What that molecule does, once it arrives, the particular way it interacts with the brain's own chemistry to create the conditions for calm, is a story that unfolds more slowly than you might expect, more slowly than a single cup, more gradually than a single evening, in a gentleness that is less like a switch being thrown and more like a light being turned down one almost imperceptible degree at a time until the room is exactly as dim as the body needs it to be. Chamomile is one of the most unassuming plants in the world. It does not grow tall. It does not produce dramatic flowers or overwhelming fragrance. If you walked past it in a field without knowing what it was, you might not stop. Small white petals arranged around a yellow center, the kind of flower a child might draw when asked to draw a flower, simple, familiar, easy to overlook. And yet this plant, so ordinary in its appearance, so modest in the way it presents itself to the world, contains within its flowers a molecule that interacts with the human brain in a way that took scientists considerable time and careful work to fully understand. The molecule is called apigenin. It belongs to a class of compounds known as flavonoids, plant-based chemicals that occur widely across the botanical world, in fruits and vegetables and flowers of many kinds, and that researchers have been studying with growing interest for their effects on human biology. Apigenin is present in many plants, but chamomile contains it in particularly high concentrations, especially in the flowers, and especially when those flowers are dried and steeped in hot water, in the way that people have been preparing chamomile tea for at least 2,000 years. What apigenin does, once it enters the body, is something that surprised researchers when they first began to map it precisely. It binds to specific receptors in the brain, the same benzodiazepine receptors that are targeted by a class of pharmaceutical medications prescribed for anxiety and sleep difficulties. These receptors are part of the gamma-aminobutyric acid signaling system, that same quieting chemistry that valerian approaches from a different angle. When these receptors are activated, neural excitability decreases. The electrical activity of the brain slows and smooths. The nervous system moves measurably in the direction of calm. The difference between apigenin and a pharmaceutical benzodiazepine is a matter of degree and specificity. Pharmaceutical compounds designed to target these receptors do so with considerable force. They bind strongly, they produce rapid and pronounced effects, and they carry with them the possibility of dependency and withdrawal that comes with any strong intervention in a sensitive biological system. Apigenin binds to the same sites, but more gently, more partially, with what researchers sometimes describe as a partial agonist effect, meaning it activates the receptor but not to its full capacity. Not a command. More like a suggestion. More like a hand placed lightly on a shoulder rather than a door firmly closed. Some scientists find this distinction meaningful beyond its pharmacological specifics. There is a growing body of research suggesting that partial gentle modulation of receptor systems may in certain contexts produce outcomes that are actually more sustainable than full activation, that the nervous system responds better over time to nudges than to commands, that the biology of rest is not best served by forcing the system into a particular state, but by creating conditions in which the system can more easily find its own way to that state. Apigenin in this framing is not so much a sleep aid as a permission slip, a small molecular signal that tells the brain it is allowed to stop working so hard. The anxiety that keeps many people from sleep is not most of the time about any single thing. It is a kind of background hum, a low-level activation of the nervous system that persists beyond its usefulness, running like a program that was opened for a specific purpose and then never fully closed. The brain continues to scan for problems, to process incomplete thoughts, to run through the events of the day and the anticipations of days not yet lived. This is not a malfunction. It is the nervous system doing exactly what it evolved to do, maintaining vigilance, monitoring the environment, keeping the organism ready to respond. The difficulty is simply that in a quiet bedroom in the dark, there is nothing to respond to. The vigilance has nowhere useful to go, and so it circles. What apigenin appears to do is interrupt that circling very gently at the receptor level. Not by silencing the brain does not go silent until sleep is fully established, and even then it remains active in ways that are essential to health and memory and restoration. But by reducing slightly and sustainably the chemical signal that keeps the nervous system in its scanning mode, by making the threshold between alert and calm a little easier to cross, by doing in molecular terms what a warm cup of something held between two hands does in experiential terms, offering a kind of reassurance that is physical before it is cognitive, that works through the body before it reaches the mind. There is something in that sequence worth noticing. The body often knows it is safe before the mind has finished checking. A warm drink held slowly in a quiet room begins to signal the nervous system through multiple channels at once, through temperature receptors in the hands and throat, through the parasympathetic activation that accompanies slow, deliberate swallowing, through the familiar scent that arrives before the liquid does. And then layered beneath all of that, the chemistry of the plant itself, moving quietly through the bloodstream, finding its way to the places in the brain where the hum of low-level vigilance is maintained, and saying in the only language it has something like, "The day is over. You have done enough. It is safe to let the edges soften now." Chamomile has been saying this in various forms for a very long time. In ancient Egypt, it was associated with the sun, and with healing pressed into oils, used in ritual preparation, considered among the most valued of medicinal plants in a culture that had no shortage of medicinal plants to choose from. In ancient Rome, soldiers carried it on long campaigns. Medieval monasteries cultivated it in their physic gardens alongside other healing herbs. The monks who tended those gardens, understanding intuitively that caring for the plants that cared for the body was a form of spiritual practice as much as a medical one. And in households across every subsequent century, in every part of the world where the plant could be grown or traded, people continued reaching for it when the nervous system needed settling, not because any of them had mapped its receptor-binding affinity, but because the experience of it was consistent, and consistency across time is its own kind of evidence. What is interesting from a contemporary scientific perspective is how well chamomile's traditional uses align with what the pharmacology actually shows. It was used historically not as a sedative, in the strong sense, not to knock a person into unconsciousness, but specifically as a nervine, a category that traditional herbalists applied to plants that calmed without dulling, that eased anxiety without erasing alertness, that helped the mind and body find a lower register without forcing them there. The partial agonist action of apigenin is in biochemical terms a nearly perfect description of what a nervine does. 2,000 years of empirical observation, it turns out, had described the mechanism with reasonable accuracy, even in the absence of any way to measure it. There is a kind of patience in that story that feels worth sitting with. The patience of people who worked with what they had, who paid close attention to what they could observe, who passed what they learned to the people who came after them through the slow, unspectacular medium of everyday practice. No grand discoveries, no dramatic revelations, just the steady accumulation of observation across time, building a picture of something real that would eventually, centuries later, be confirmed in a laboratory. Chamomile did not change. The apigenin was always there, binding to those receptors, producing those effects in the hands of the Egyptian healer and the Roman soldier and the medieval monk, and every person who has made a quiet cup of it in a kitchen late at night while the rest of the house was already sleeping. What changed was our ability to describe what we were observing. The plant, patient and unhurried as it has always been, simply waited for the description to arrive. And perhaps that is something that extends beyond chamomile, beyond any single plant or any single molecule. The idea that the body carries its own kind of knowledge, that it has been accumulating information about what it needs and what helps it for longer than language has existed, and that sometimes what serves it best is not something new, but something very old, offered gently in the quiet of an evening without expectation or urgency. Rest does not always need to be manufactured. Sometimes it only needs to be allowed. And there are other plants that work in this direction too, not through the receptor systems of the brain, but through deeper channels, ones that most people have never thought about because those channels are not the ones we associate with medicine or with thought. They run through the body in ways that are harder to name, but no less real for being harder to name. A slow, intelligent scientists are beginning to suggest that lives not in the brain, but in other places, entirely in the tissue, in the breath, in the spaces between heartbeats where the body keeps its quietest and most essential conversations with itself. There is a vine that grows in warm climates, winding itself around whatever it can find, fence posts, tree branches, the edges of old stone walls, with a kind of quiet persistence that seems almost unhurried for something that is technically always moving. Passion flower does not look medicinal. It looks, if anything, theatrical, its flowers among the most elaborate in the botanical world, with layered petals and a crown of thin filaments arranged in concentric rings, the whole structure so intricate that early European explorers who encountered it in South America thought it must carry some deep symbolic meaning and spent considerable effort trying to decode what that meaning was. What they were actually looking at was a pollination strategy, the flower's complexity shaped by millions of years of coevolution with specific insects, each structural detail serving a precise biological function. But the impulse to find meaning in it is understandable. It is the kind of flower that makes a person slow down and look more carefully than they usually would. The part that matters for sleep is not the flower, though. It is the leaf and the stem and the quiet chemistry running through both, a chemistry that works through a mechanism so specific, so elegantly targeted that when researchers first mapped it in detail, several of them noted how unusual it was to find something this precise in a plant that grows wild, without cultivation, in fields and roadsides across multiple continents. Passion flower contains compounds, among them a group of flavonoids, including one called chrysin, along with several alkaloids and maltol that appear to inhibit an enzyme called monoamine oxidase. But the more consistently studied mechanism involves the gamma-aminobutyric acid system, again approached from a direction that is different from both valerian and chamomile. Where valerian slows the breakdown of gamma-aminobutyric acid and chamomile's apigenin binds gently to the receptor, passion flower appears to work partly by increasing the sensitivity of the receptor itself, making the brain's quieting system more responsive to the gamma-aminobutyric acid that is already present, rather than adding more of it or slowing its removal. The distinction is subtle, but it is real. Think of it this way, if it helps. The gamma-aminobutyric acid system in the brain is something like a dimmer switch for neural excitability. It does not turn the light off. It adjusts the level, finding the setting that allows the nervous system to function without running at full intensity. Valerian, in a manner of speaking, keeps more of the dimming agent available. Chamomile's apigenin reaches for the switch itself and moves it a small, gentle amount. Passion flower, according to some researchers, makes the switch more sensitive so that the same amount of movement produces a slightly greater effect. 3 plants, 3 different points of entry into the same fundamental system. 3 different ways of helping the nervous system find its way to a lower register. Scientists who study plant-based sleep compounds sometimes describe passion flower as having a particular affinity for the kind of sleep disruption that comes specifically from the mind refusing to stop. Not the exhaustion that makes sleep difficult, that is a different problem with different underlying chemistry, but the particular quality of wakefulness that arrives at the end of a long day and simply will not yield. The thoughts that keep generating more thoughts. The awareness that keeps refreshing itself. The sense of being tired and alert at the same time, which is perhaps the most uncomfortable combination the nervous system can produce. There is a specific region of the brain involved in this phenomenon: the prefrontal cortex, the large, evolutionarily recent structure at the front of the brain that handles planning analysis, self-monitoring, and the kind of recursive thinking that allows a person to think about their own thinking, maintains a higher level of activity during wakefulness than almost any other brain region. It is in some ways the part of the brain that is hardest to convince that it can stop. It is accustomed to being in charge. It is designed to stay engaged, to keep processing, to continue evaluating, even when all the information that needs evaluating has already been evaluated, and the conclusions, to the extent that conclusions are available, have already been reached. Research has shown that healthy sleep onset requires a measurable decrease in prefrontal cortex activity, a quieting of that particular region's metabolic rate, as the brain transitions from wakefulness into the early stages of sleep. In people who struggle to fall asleep, this quieting is often delayed. The prefrontal cortex remains active past the point where the rest of the brain is ready to begin the sleep process. It keeps thinking. It keeps checking. It keeps doing the job it was designed to do, even when the job for the night is finished. What passionflower appears to offer through its modulation of the gamma-aminobutyric acid receptor system is a gentle signal to this particular quality of over-engagement, not a sedative suppression of the whole brain. Something more localized, more specific, a softening of the insistence that keeps the mind rehearsing and reviewing when the body has long since indicated that it would prefer to rest. Studies in humans using standardized passionflower preparations have found improvements in sleep quality that go beyond simple time to sleep onset. Participants reported improvements in sleep depth, in the feeling of being rested upon waking, and specifically in the reduction of that particular pre-sleep experience of mental activity that feels uncontrollable, thoughts arriving unbidden attention, jumping between unfinished things, the quality of mental busyness that is exhausting precisely because it produces nothing useful. What passionflower seems to address is not sleep itself, but the interference pattern that prevents it. And there is something philosophically interesting in that, something that goes beyond the pharmacology into the territory of how we think about rest in general. The assumption that sleep requires effort, that it must be pursued and achieved and managed, is, researchers suggest, itself part of the problem for many people. Sleep is not a performance. It is not something the brain does by trying harder. It is something the brain does when the conditions for it are present and the obstacles to it have been sufficiently reduced. The passionflower vine grows over things. It does not push through obstacles. It finds the spaces that are already there and moves through them slowly in whatever direction offers the least resistance. There is no urgency in the way it grows, no apparent preference for speed over thoroughness. It takes what is available and continues unhurried in the same direction it was already moving. Some people find that image easier to carry into the hours before sleep than any amount of deliberate relaxation effort. Not trying to fall asleep, not working toward it, simply removing one by one the small resistances that were in the way, and then allowing what was already there underneath the noise and the reviewing and the rehearsing to surface in its own time. Research suggests that passionflower may be one of the few botanical compounds that shows measurable effects even in people who describe themselves as generally healthy sleepers, not those with clinical insomnia, but those who occasionally experience the particular frustration of lying awake while tired, unable to locate the off switch they know must exist somewhere. The effect in these cases is not dramatic. It is not the kind of change that announces itself. It is the kind of change that you might only notice in retrospect, a morning when you realize you do not remember the exact moment sleep arrived, which is perhaps the most precise description of what good sleep actually is. The vine keeps growing, quietly, without hurry. Finding its way around every surface, it encounters not by force, but by the simple persistence of a living thing that knows, without knowing, that it knows exactly where it is going. And somewhere in that slow, unhurried intelligence, not just in passion flower, but in all the plants we have been moving through tonight, there is something that the tired human nervous system recognizes, not as information, not as instruction, but as a kind of companionship in the dark. The sense that the world outside is also in its own way engaged in the slow work of nighttime, processing, exchanging, moving through its chemistry with a patience that asks nothing in return. The body understands this kind of presence even when the mind is still too busy to notice it, and the mind, given time and a little chemical assistance, usually catches up. What catches up next is something even deeper than thought, something that lives below the level of the prefrontal cortex, entirely in the older and less celebrated parts of the body's awareness. Parts that have been receiving information all along, quietly, through channels that most of us have never been taught to consider as channels at all. Most people think of smell as something that happens in the nose. And it does, of course. The nasal passages contain specialized receptor cells that detect airborne molecules and send signals along the olfactory nerve directly to the brain, bypassing the usual routing that other senses use, arriving almost immediately in the limbic system, that older and more emotionally immediate part of the brain, where memory and feeling are processed before analytical thought has a chance to intervene. This is why a scent can return you to a moment from 20 years ago, before you have consciously recognized what you are smelling. The signal arrives at emotion before it arrives at understanding. It is one of the most direct routes the external world has into the interior of a person. But what researchers have discovered over the past few decades is that olfactory receptors, the molecular structures that detect and respond to aromatic compounds, are not confined to the nose. They are distributed throughout the body in ways that until recently most scientists did not expect to find them. Olfactory receptor proteins have been identified in the lungs, where they appear to play a role in regulating airway dilation and the rate of breathing. They have been found in the skin, where some researchers believe they participate in wound healing and cell regeneration. They have been located in the kidneys, in the intestinal lining, in muscle tissue. And perhaps most surprisingly, they have been found in the heart, in cardiac muscle cells, where stimulation of certain olfactory receptors appears to influence heart rate in ways that researchers are still working to characterize fully. The body, it turns out, is listening through its skin, through its lungs, through the walls of its own internal organs. What this means practically is that when aromatic compounds from medicinal plants enter the body, whether through the breath, through the skin, during a warm bath, through the mucous membranes, they are not speaking only to the brain. They are entering into a much more distributed conversation, one that involves tissues and organs that the body does not normally associate with sensation or perception in any conscious sense. The heart may be responding to lavender in ways that never reach awareness. The lungs may be responding to the volatile compounds in a steam from chamomile in ways that adjust the breathing pattern before the mind has noticed any change at all. This is, scientists suggest, a much older system than the conscious nose. The olfactory receptor family is one of the largest gene families in the human genome. Humans carry somewhere in the range of 400 functional olfactory receptor genes, a number that seems disproportionately large for a species that relies so heavily on vision and is generally considered to have a relatively modest sense of smell compared to other mammals. The reason for this apparent excess may lie partly in these non-nasal functions in the distributed sensory work that olfactory receptors perform throughout the bodywork that has nothing to do with the conscious detection of odors and everything to do with the quiet, continuous monitoring of chemical conditions in the internal environment. The body is always reading the air around it, even when the mind is not paying attention. And in the hours before sleep, when the mind is beginning to release its grip on the day, and the body is doing the gradual work of shifting from its daytime mode of operation to its nighttime mode, this distributed chemical sensing may play a role that is more significant than we typically recognize. The slowing of the breath that occurs naturally in the early stages of drowsiness creates a different pattern of airflow through the nasal passages and into the lungs, a pattern that changes which compounds are encountered in what concentration for how long. The body's position in sleep changes the circulation of blood to different tissues, altering the rate at which absorbed compounds are delivered to different receptor sites. Even the temperature of the skin changes as sleep approaches, and temperature affects the rate at which volatile molecules evaporate and enter the immediate environment of the body. Sleep, in this sense, creates its own chemistry, and the plants have been calibrated to that chemistry for a very long time. There is a concept in sensory neuroscience called embodied perception. The idea that perception is not something that happens exclusively in the brain, but is distributed across the entire body, shaped by the physical state of the organism at any given moment. Perception is not just receiving information. It is receiving information through a body that is always in some particular state, tense or relaxed, warm or cool, moving or still, and that state shapes what is received and how it is processed before any of it becomes conscious experience. This is why the same piece of music can feel completely different, depending on whether you are listening to it while rushing through a task or lying still in a darkened room. The sound waves are identical. What changes is the body through which they pass. The same principle applies to plant compounds. Linalool, encountered by a body that is already moving toward rest, interacts with a different physiological environment than linalool encountered by a body in the middle of a stressful afternoon. The receptor systems are in different states. The nervous system is at a different baseline. The feedback loops between the brain and the body are carrying different traffic. What the compound finds when it arrives is not a fixed target, but a moving system, and the effect it produces is shaped by the state of that system as much as by the compound itself. This is partly why the ritual around sleep matters as much as the chemistry. Researchers who study sleep hygiene, the constellation of habits and environmental conditions that support healthy sleep, consistently find that the preparation for sleep is not separable from sleep itself. The dimming of lights in the hour before bed is not just a way of avoiding stimulation. Light in the blue wavelength range actively suppresses the production of melatonin, the hormone that regulates the body's sleep-wake cycle, by signaling to a small cluster of light-sensitive cells in the retina that communicate directly with the brain's internal clock. Reducing that light allows melatonin levels to rise, naturally shifting the body's chemistry in the direction it needs to go. The warmth of a bath or a warm drink in the evening hours does something similar through a different mechanism. Core body temperature drops naturally in the hours before sleep. This drop is itself part of the sleep initiation signal, a thermostatic shift that helps tell the brain it is time to transition into its nighttime mode. A warm bath raises the body's surface temperature temporarily, but when you step out of the bath into cooler air, the rate of heat dissipation accelerates, producing a more rapid drop in core temperature than would otherwise occur. The body interprets this drop as a stronger version of its own natural sleep signal. The ritual of the warm bath is, without anyone having planned it this way, a physiological nudge in exactly the right direction. And when that ritual includes the aromatic compounds of sleep-associated plants, when the bathwater contains lavender, or the warm drink is chamomile, or the air in the room carries the scent of plants that have been used for rest across centuries, multiple systems are being addressed simultaneously. The warmth, the slowing breath, the dim light, the quiet, and beneath all of that, the distributed chemistry of a body that is receiving signals through its skin and its lungs, and the older, less celebrated sensory systems that run through every tissue, systems that do not report to consciousness, but that have been shaping the body's relationship with the plant world for longer than consciousness, as we experience it, has existed. You do not have to be aware of all of this for it to be happening. That is in some ways the most restful thing about it. The body does not require the mind's supervision to receive what the plants are offering. It knows what to do with these molecules. It has always known. The knowing is encoded not in memory or understanding, but in the deep structural grammar of receptors and responses that predates every word ever spoken about rest or sleep or the medicinal properties of anything growing in the earth. The mind can simply be present for this without needing to direct it, and as the body continues its quiet receiving, through the breath, through the skin, through all the channels that run deeper than thought, something else begins to happen in the landscape around it. Something that has been occurring in forests and meadows and the edges of rivers for a span of time that makes 2,000 years of human herbal history feel, in comparison, quite recent. A chemistry of connection that moves not through the nervous system at all, but through the air itself, and through the soil, and through the slow, green patience of things that have never needed to hurry. In 1982, the Japanese government introduced a concept into its national health program that had no direct equivalent in Western medicine at the time. They called it Shinrin-yoku. It translates roughly into English as forest bathing, though the translation loses something in the crossing because what the Japanese term describes is not bathing in any active sense. It is closer to immersion, to the simple act of being present in a forest environment, moving slowly through it, breathing the air that moves through it, allowing the senses to receive what is there without directing them toward any particular purpose. Not hiking with a destination, not exercising with a goal, simply being inside the forest for a period of time in a state of quiet and unhurried receptivity. The program was introduced not as a cultural initiative, but as a public health one, based on early research suggesting that time spent in forest environments produced measurable changes in human physiology, changes that went well beyond what could be explained by exercise or stress reduction alone. Over the decades that followed, Japanese researchers accumulated a substantial body of evidence around these changes, and what they found has continued to interest scientists in fields ranging from immunology to psychiatry to environmental medicine. The key, it turned out, was in the air. Forests, particularly forests dominated by coniferous trees such as cedar pine and cypress, release into the atmosphere a class of compounds called phytoncides. The word comes from the Greek for plant and the Latin for to exterminate, which reflects the original understanding of these compounds as plant defense chemicals, volatile substances released by trees to inhibit the growth of bacteria, fungi, and other organisms that might damage them. And they do serve that defensive function. But what researchers discovered was that these same compounds, when inhaled by humans moving through a forest environment, produce a range of physiological responses that have nothing to do with plant defense and everything to do with human health. Among the most consistently documented of these responses is an increase in the activity of natural killer cells, a type of immune cell that plays a central role in identifying and destroying damaged or abnormal cells in the body. Studies measuring immune function before and after multi-day forest visits found increases in natural killer cell activity that persisted for more than a week after participants had returned to their usual urban environments. A single weekend in a forest-breathing, phytoncide-rich air produced immune changes that lasted longer than the visit itself. Control experiments conducted in urban hotel environments with participants following similar schedules of rest and relaxation, but without the forest air, showed no equivalent effect. The immune response was specific to the phytoncides, not simply to the rest. Researchers also measured significant decreases in cortisol, the primary stress hormone produced by the adrenal glands in response to perceived threat or demand in participants after forest immersion. Cortisol is not simply a marker of stress in the negative sense. It is a necessary and useful hormone that regulates metabolism, immune function, and the body's response to challenge. But chronically elevated cortisol of the kind that accumulates across weeks and months of sustained pressure and insufficient recovery has well-documented effects on sleep quality, on immune competence, and on the function of the prefrontal cortex itself. Reducing cortisol levels even temporarily allows the body to reset toward a lower baseline to return, at least partially, to the kind of physiological state it functions best in. What alpha-pinene and beta-pinene, two of the most common phytoncides released by coniferous trees, appear to do in the human nervous system goes beyond immune modulation and cortisol reduction. Some researchers have found that these compounds, when inhaled, produce measurable effects on the autonomic nervous system, the division of the nervous system that regulates the body's automatic functions, including heart rate, breathing rate, blood pressure, and the balance between the sympathetic state of activation and the parasympathetic state of rest and recovery. The autonomic nervous system operates in two modes that are, broadly speaking, in dynamic balance with each other. The sympathetic mode is the one most people are more familiar with. By its effects, if not by its name, it is the state of readiness, of mobilization, of the body preparing to meet a demand. Heart rate rises slightly. Breathing becomes shallower and faster. Blood is directed toward the large muscle groups. Digestion slows. The body is oriented toward action. This is not a harmful state. It is an appropriate and necessary state for meeting the challenges of an active day. The difficulty arises when it persists past the point of usefulness, when the demands of the day have ended, but the physiology of meeting those demands continues running like an engine left idling long after the journey is complete. The parasympathetic mode is its counterpart, the state of rest, of recovery of the body, doing the work of restoration that can only happen when the sympathetic drive has quieted. Digestion resumes, heart rate slows and becomes more variable in a healthy way. Breathing deepens, the immune system becomes more active. Cellular repair processes that are suppressed during high sympathetic activation can proceed. And crucially, for the purposes of sleep, the neurochemical conditions for healthy sleep onset are predominantly parasympathetic in character. The body needs to be in this mode or moving clearly toward it before sleep can proceed in the deep restorative way that leaves a person genuinely rested. Phytoncides research shows shift the balance of the autonomic nervous system measurably in the direction of parasympathetic dominance. Heart rate variability, a measure of the subtle variation in time between consecutive heartbeats that researchers use as an index of parasympathetic tone, increases during forest immersion in ways that are consistent with a genuine shift toward the rest and recovery mode. Blood pressure decreases. Breathing rate slows without any conscious effort to slow it. The body moves of its own accord and without instruction toward the physiological state that supports rest. And here is something that carries a particular quiet significance for this kind of evening. You do not need to be in a forest for phytoncides to reach you. The compounds are small enough and volatile enough that a diffuser carrying cedar wood or pine essential oil in a bedroom produces measurable concentrations of alpha-pinene and related compounds in the surrounding air. A small bundle of dried cedar placed near a bed. A few drops of a conifer-derived oil on a cloth nearby. The concentrations are lower than those in a dense forest on a humid morning, certainly. But researchers studying indoor phytoncide exposure have found that even modest concentrations produce detectable shifts in autonomic balance. Small, gentle nudges in the direction of parasympathetic activity that are consistent with what forest immersion produces, scaled down but real. The forest does not have to be outside your window for the forest to be in some small chemical sense present. There is something in that which feels both scientifically interesting and personally accessible. The idea that the chemistry of one of the most restorative natural environments on Earth is not locked away in distant wilderness, but is reproducible, at least partially, in the ordinary space of an evening room, that the body's response to these compounds is not contingent on the grandeur of the setting, because the receptors that receive them do not have eyes and do not know whether they are in an old-growth forest or a quiet bedroom. They only know what arrives. And what arrives slowly through the breath, through the skin, through the distributed sensory systems of a body that is already moving toward rest is something that speaks in a language older than any forest that currently exists. A chemical grammar that the human body learned during the long ages when there were no cities and no rooms and no evenings of the kind we are describing, only the trees and the dark and the slow, patient chemistry of the world, continuing around sleeping bodies as it continues now just beyond the walls. The rhythm of that continuity is not something you have to find. It finds you in the breath. And when you follow it inward, past the surface of things, past the familiar textures of thought and memory and the accumulated weight of a day, what you encounter is something that has always been there, measured in the quiet spaces between one heartbeat and the next. A rhythm so fundamental that science has needed decades and considerable ingenuity simply to find the tools precise enough to observe it. And what that rhythm reveals, when it is finally observed clearly, is not a mystery, but something closer to its opposite. A pattern so consistent, so reliably present across every living body that it begins to feel less like a discovery and more like a recognition. The heart does not beat like a metronome. This is one of those facts that seems simple on the surface, but carries something quietly profound underneath it. The kind of fact that changes slightly how you imagine the interior of your own body once you have encountered it. A metronome is perfectly regular. It divides time into identical intervals, each one indistinguishable from the last. The heart, in a healthy body, does not do this. The intervals between heartbeats vary continuously, lengthening slightly during the exhale, shortening slightly during the inhale, shifting gently in response to temperature and thought and movement, and the thousand small adjustments the body is making at any given moment to maintain its internal balance. This variation is not a flaw in the system. It is, researchers have come to understand, a sign of the system's health. The measure of this variation is called heart rate variability, and it has become one of the most studied markers in cardiovascular and autonomic medicine over the past several decades. A heart that beats with too little variation too mechanically, too evenly, is a heart whose regulatory systems are not responding flexibly to the body's changing needs. Low heart rate variability is associated with reduced resilience, with diminished capacity to recover from stress, with a nervous system that has lost some of its ability to shift between states as circumstances demand. High heart rate variability, by contrast, reflects a nervous system that is responsive and adaptive, one that can move easily between the mode of engagement and the mode of rest, that does not get stuck at either extreme but oscillates fluidly between them as the body requires. And here is what makes this particularly relevant to a quiet evening in the company of plants. Several of the medicinal compounds found in sleep-associated plants appear to influence heart rate variability in measurable ways. Linalool from lavender, the phytoncides from coniferous trees, certain flavonoid compounds from chamomile and passion flower, each of these, through their respective interactions with the autonomic nervous system, tends to shift heart rate variability in the direction associated with parasympathetic dominance. The intervals between heartbeats become slightly more variable in the particular pattern that reflects relaxation and recovery, rather than the compressed, less variable pattern associated with sustained sympathetic activation. What this means in the language of the body rather than the laboratory is that these compounds are helping the heart find its natural rhythm again. Not a faster rhythm or a slower one necessarily, but a more variable one. A rhythm that breathes in, the way that healthy biological systems breathe, expanding and contracting, responding and releasing, never fixed at one point for longer than the moment requires. The heart in this state is not resting in the sense of doing nothing. It is resting in the deeper sense of doing exactly what the present moment calls for, no more and no less, with a responsiveness that requires no conscious direction. Some researchers who study the relationship between heart rate variability and sleep have found that higher parasympathetic tone in the pre-sleep period, measurable through heart rate variability metrics in the hour before sleep onset, is one of the strongest physiological predictors of sleep quality. Not sleep duration necessarily, but sleep depth. The kind of sleep that involves the slow wave stages, where the body does its most significant physical restoration, where growth hormone is released, where the immune system performs maintenance functions that cannot easily happen during waking hours. The quality of the hour before sleep shapes the quality of the sleep itself, and the quality of that hour is written in part in the variation between heartbeats. This is a rhythm that connects in ways that are not metaphorical but genuinely biological to the rhythms of the plant world. Plants do not have hearts, but they do have oscillating systems, internal rhythms that expand and contract in response to the conditions around them, that vary rather than remaining fixed, that are more accurately described as dynamic equilibria than as steady states. The stomata on the underside of a leaf, the tiny pores through which the plant exchanges gases with the atmosphere, open and close in rhythmic cycles across the day and night, responding to light and temperature and humidity and the plant's own internal chemical signals. The rate of transpiration, the movement of water from the soil through the plant and out into the air, follows rhythms that interact with both the plant's internal clock and the environmental conditions of each particular day. Even the growth of a plant, when studied with time-lapse photography and precise measurement tools, turns out to be not a smooth and continuous process, but a rhythmic one with periods of faster extension, alternating with periods of consolidation. A pulse of growth that follows patterns researchers are still working to fully characterize. Living systems, it appears, tend toward oscillation rather than constancy. And the more scientists look at the relationship between the oscillatory rhythms of plants and the oscillatory rhythms of the human body, the more they find resonances that seem to run deeper than coincidence. The circadian rhythms that govern a plant's daily chemical cycle operate on the same approximately 24-hour period as the circadian rhythms that govern human sleep and wakefulness. Not because plants and humans coordinate with each other directly, but because both are responding to the same fundamental environmental signal, the rotation of the Earth and the daily cycle of light and dark that it produces. Both have evolved to anticipate this cycle, rather than simply react to it, building internal clocks that run even in constant conditions, maintaining their rhythm in the absence of the external cue that originally set them. This shared calibration to the same planetary rhythm may be part of why certain plant compounds interact with human sleep chemistry in ways that feel, from the body's perspective, so natural. The plants that produce these compounds are operating on the same clock. Their chemical activity peaks and ebbs in rhythms that are not foreign to the human body, but genuinely familiar, calibrated to the same 24-hour cycle. The same relationship between light and dark, the same deep biological expectation of what the night is for. When the compounds these plants produce at their most chemically active moments enter a human body that is itself moving through its own version of the same cycle, there is a kind of resonance that researchers describe in careful measured language, but that the body simply experiences as ease. The feeling of ease is not nothing. It is, in fact, one of the most informative signals the body produces. It is the nervous system's way of indicating that conditions are appropriate, that the environment is compatible with the body's needs, that no significant mismatches are being detected between what is expected and what is present. A body that feels at ease in an environment is a body whose regulatory systems are not being called upon to manage threats or compensate for deficits. It is a body that can afford to direct its resources toward maintenance and restoration, rather than defense and vigilance. The medicinal plants associated with sleep may work, at least in part, by producing precisely this signal, by creating through their chemistry an environment that the body recognizes as appropriate for rest. Not by forcing the body into rest, but by reducing the gap between where the body is and where it needs to be in order for rest to arrive naturally. Research on what scientists sometimes call olfactory autonomic coupling, the direct relationship between specific inhaled compounds and autonomic nervous system states, continues to reveal how precisely some plant compounds are matched to specific physiological effects. Alpha-pinene from coniferous trees increases parasympathetic tone. Linalool from lavender reduces the electrical activity of neurons in brain regions associated with anxiety processing. Apigenin from chamomile modulates the receptor systems that set the threshold between alert and calm. Each compound arriving at a slightly different point in the system, each producing a slightly different quality of shift, each contributing to an overall movement in a direction that has been for the body the right direction at the end of a day for as long as there have been days. And within all of this, within the chemistry and the rhythms and the slow biological conversation between plants and the bodies that live alongside them, there is a garden. Not a metaphorical one, a real one, in the sense that all of what has been described tonight exists in real places, in real soil, growing in the real air of a world that continues its chemical life, regardless of whether anyone is paying attention to it. A garden of plants that have been companioning human rest for millennia, each offering what it has through its own particular chemistry, each most potent in the hours when the dark is deepest, each part of a world that is, in a very real sense, always already present outside windows, in dried bundles, in the warmth of a cup, in the invisible chemistry of the air of a quiet room. It is a garden that does not require an invitation to enter. It has always been there at the edges of sleep, offering what it offers to anyone, still enough to receive it. And what remains at this point in the evening is simply the question of how close to that stillness a person can come, how many of the ordinary resistances of waking life can be allowed to soften one by one until what is underneath them is the only thing left, which turns out to be quieter than most people expect, and more spacious, and very, very close. There is a hypothesis in environmental psychology that has been gathering evidence quietly for several decades now without ever quite becoming the kind of news that announces itself loudly. It was proposed in the 1980s by a biologist named Edward Wilson, who suggested that human beings carry within them an innate tendency to seek connection with other living things, with plants, with animals, with the textures and rhythms of the natural world. He called this tendency biophilia, from the Greek for life and love, and he framed it not as a cultural preference or an aesthetic inclination, but as something older than culture, a biological orientation toward living systems that developed over the long span of human evolution during the millions of years when the ability to read a landscape, to understand the behavior of other species, to find sustenance and shelter in relationship with the living world was not a leisure interest, but a survival requirement. The hypothesis has been studied from many angles since then, and what the research has consistently found is that exposure to living plants, not dramatic wilderness, not pristine nature, but ordinary living plants in ordinary indoor spaces, produces measurable effects on human physiology and psychology that are difficult to explain by any mechanism other than something like what Wilson described. Plants in a room lower the concentration of airborne volatile organic compounds through a process of phytoremediation, the absorption of certain gaseous molecules through the leaf surface and the root system, a capacity that plants evolved as part of their own chemical management, but that happens to be useful for the air quality of enclosed human spaces. Studies conducted in office environments found that rooms containing plants showed lower concentrations of certain airborne compounds than comparable rooms without them, and that the people working in those rooms reported measurably lower levels of fatigue and cognitive difficulty across the workday. But the effects go beyond air chemistry. Research on hospital patients found that those recovering in rooms with a view of plants or with plants present in the room required less pain. Medication reported lower perceived pain levels, had shorter hospital stays, and showed lower blood pressure and heart rate during the recovery period than patients in comparable rooms without plants. The plants were not delivering any compound to these patients. They were simply present, and their presence visible, living quietly growing, was producing physiological changes in the people sharing the space with them. Some researchers suggest this reflects something in the visual processing of living biological structures that is genuinely distinct from the processing of non-living objects. The human visual system, shaped by millions of years of navigating environments where the presence of healthy vegetation signaled safety, resource availability, and the absence of immediate threat, may respond to living plants at a level below conscious perception, activating very gently the same signals that a lush and well-watered landscape would have activated in an ancestor reading a terrain for signs of habitability. Not dramatically, not consciously, but in the quiet background processing of a nervous system that is always, even now, evaluating the environment it finds itself in and adjusting its level of vigilance accordingly. A room with living plants is a room the nervous system reads at some pre-conscious level as a safer room. This is speculative, as researchers are careful to note. The full mechanism is not yet understood, but the consistency of the effect across studies conducted in very different contexts, hospitals and offices, and homes and schools, with participants who range widely in age and background, and stated feelings about plants suggests something real is happening, even if the complete story of what and why is still being assembled. What is better understood is the specific relationship between indoor plants and sleep environments. Several species of plants commonly kept indoors have been studied for their effects on bedroom air quality and sleep quality. Snake plants, known formally as Sansevieria, and notable for being among the few plants that continue to release oxygen and absorb carbon dioxide through the night, rather than reversing this process in the absence of light, as most plants do, have been found in some studies to contribute meaningfully to oxygen levels in enclosed sleep spaces. The jasmine plant, whose delicate white flowers release a scent that contains compounds related to those in other sleep-associated botanicals, has been studied in controlled bedroom environments where participants sleeping in its presence showed improvements in sleep efficiency and reported feeling more alert the following morning, an effect that seems paradoxical until you consider that deeper, more restorative sleep produces more genuine alertness upon waking, not less. Aloe vera releases oxygen at night through a process called crassulacean acid metabolism, a water-conserving photosynthetic strategy that certain succulent plants use to survive arid conditions, which involves keeping stomata closed during the hot daylight hours and opening them at night, instead conducting gas exchange in the cool darkness when water loss is minimal. The biological strategy that evolved to help a desert plant survive becomes, in a bedroom on an ordinary evening, a quiet contribution to the oxygen richness of the sleeping air. There is something in all of this that speaks to a kind of relationship that requires very little effort to maintain. Not a demanding relationship, not one that asks for much in return. A small plant on a windowsill is not a significant commitment. It needs water occasionally and some access to light, and beyond that, it goes about its business, quietly doing what plants do, converting light and carbon dioxide into oxygen and organic matter, releasing compounds into the air as a byproduct of its own metabolic processes, maintaining its own rhythms of growth and rest that run parallel to, but independent of, the rhythms of the household around it. And yet its presence is not neutral. The air around it is slightly different. The quality of light filtered through its leaves is slightly different. The visual field of a person in the room with it is slightly different, softened at the edges by the irregular organic shapes that the human visual system processes differently than the straight lines and flat surfaces of manufactured objects. Researchers who study restorative environments, spaces that support psychological recovery from the demands of sustained attention and cognitive effort, have found that certain visual qualities consistently appear in environments people rate as restorative. Complexity without chaos. Organic irregularity. The presence of natural materials and natural forms. The quality they call fascination, a kind of low-level, effortless interest that holds attention gently without demanding concentration, allowing the directed attention systems of the brain to rest, while the softer, more diffuse attention of wonder does the looking instead. A garden has all of these qualities, even a small one, even one that consists of a few pots on a shelf and a trailing vine near a window. The brain, in the presence of living plants, shifts measurably toward the mode of attention associated with rest and recovery, away from the focused, effortful, resource-intensive mode of directed attention that most waking hours require, towards something more open, more receptive, more aligned with the state from which sleep naturally arises. And perhaps this is the deepest thing that medicinal plants offer, beneath all the specific chemistry and all the receptor binding and all the named compounds and their documented effects. not just molecules, but presence. The presence of something that is living and unhurried and engaged in its own processes alongside, but not dependent on the processes of the person in the room. Something that is doing what it does, growing slowly, breathing in its quiet way, producing its chemistry in the dark, regardless of whether it is observed or appreciated or even noticed. A companionship that requires nothing and offers something that is difficult to name precisely, but that shows up consistently in the data, in the lower cortisol levels, in the slower heart rates, in the improved sleep quality, and the reduced fatigue, and the particular quality of ease that comes from being in a space where something alive and unhurried is simply present. Humans have been keeping plants near their sleeping spaces for a very long time. In ancient Egypt, aromatic plants were placed in sleeping rooms and funeral chambers spaces that both required in the Egyptian understanding the same kind of careful preparation for the passage between one state and another. In ancient China, chrysanthemum and other calming plants were cultivated specifically in bedroom gardens, their cultivation considered part of the art of creating conditions for proper rest. In medieval European tradition, the practice of strewing herbs, spreading fragrant plants across floors and bedchambers was partly hygienic and partly something that the people doing it understood without the language to explain it, as contributing to the quality of sleep in the rooms they prepared. The understanding arrived in different forms in different cultures at different times, but it arrived consistently at the same quiet conclusion that the space where a person sleeps is not simply a shelter from the weather. It is an environment, and like all environments, it can be shaped gently, modestly, with living things that ask very little and give in return something that the tired body knows how to receive. The garden does not have to be elaborate. It only has to be alive. And as the night continues, its work around you, the plants in the world outside, doing what they do, the mycorrhizal networks sending their slow signals through the soil, the circadian chemistry of 1,000 species following the same long arc of dark toward light that has been running without interruption since before any of this had a name. What remains to be said grows smaller and quieter until it is not much more than a breath and the particular quality of silence that follows it. The kind of silence that is not empty, but full of the small sounds of a settling house, of air moving gently, of the biological processes of a body that is already in its wisdom, beginning to do what it has always known how to do without being asked. Sleep does not arrive the way we sometimes imagine it does. It does not descend from outside like weather moving in across a landscape. It does not switch on or switch off. It is not a door that opens and closes. What researchers who study the transition from wakefulness into sleep have found, when they observe it closely enough, with the tools available to them, is something far more gradual than any of those images suggest. A slow recession, like water pulling back from a shore, leaving behind a quieter surface than the one that was there before. The brain does not go dark when sleep arrives. It changes frequency. It shifts from the relatively fast, irregular electrical activity of a mind engaged with the world into slower, more synchronized patterns, the theta waves of early drowsiness rolling through the brain like long swells across a calm sea. And then as sleep deepens, the delta waves of slow-wave sleep, which are the slowest and largest brain waves the sleeping brain produces, moving through the neural tissue with a massiveness and a gentleness that researchers who first measured them described in terms that carried, almost despite themselves, a quality of awe. The brain in deep sleep is not inactive. It is doing some of its most important work. A system called the glymphatic system discovered only in the early part of this century and still being studied with the excitement that surrounds, genuinely new understanding becomes dramatically more active during deep sleep. The spaces between brain cells expand by nearly 60% compared to their waking dimensions, allowing cerebrospinal fluid to flow more freely through the tissue, clearing away the metabolic byproducts that accumulate during the day's neural activity. The brain during sleep washes itself. It performs a kind of maintenance that cannot happen with anything like the same efficiency while wakefulness is present. The fluid moves through slowly, quietly, following the long channels between cells, doing work that is invisible and essential, and that the sleeping person will never be aware of having needed. There is something deeply reassuring in that, if you allow it to land softly. The body knows what to do in the dark. It has always known. The glymphatic clearing that happens in the sleeping brain tonight has been happening in human brains for as long as there have been human brains capable of needing it, which is to say, for a very long time, before anyone had the tools to observe it, or the curiosity to look, or the language to describe what they were finding. The maintenance was occurring without anyone's knowledge that maintenance was required. The biology was serving itself quietly and reliably in the absence of any supervision. This is perhaps the deepest thing that sleep science has revealed across all the decades of studying what happens in the sleeping body and brain. Not that sleep is complicated though it is, not that it is fragile though it can be, but that it is fundamentally self-organizing. That the body, given conditions that are even approximately right, will move toward the sleep it needs with a persistence and an intelligence that operates entirely below the level of decision or effort. The glymphatic system does not wait to be told to activate. The slow waves do not wait for instruction. The immune maintenance and the hormonal regulation and the memory consolidation that sleep makes possible do not require the sleeping person to do anything other than be still enough and safe enough and chemically supported enough for the process to unfold. The plants have been part of that support for a very long time, not in a dramatic way, not in the way of cures or interventions or anything that announces itself as medicine in the modern sense of the word, but in the quieter way of chemistry meeting, chemistry of compounds shaped by millions of years of plant evolution arriving in a body shaped by millions of years of animal evolution and finding between them a kind of recognition. The linalool and the receptor, the apigenin and the binding site, the phyton side and the autonomic nervous system making its small, effortless adjustment toward rest. Things fitting together not because anyone designed them to fit, but because they have been in relationship in one form or another for longer than the current version of either of them has existed. Scientists suggest that this evolutionary relationship between humans and the plant world is encoded not just in our receptor systems, but in our responses to plant environments more broadly, in the way the visual complexity of foliage rests the attention, in the way the smell of damp soil after rain produces a measurable decrease in stress hormones, in the way the sound of moving water and wind through leaves slows the breathing in people who hear it even when they are indoors, and the sound is a recording, and the rational mind knows perfectly well that there is no actual forest nearby. The body believes what the body believes, and what it has believed for a very long time is that the presence of plants is a signal of safety, that the smell of certain leaves and roots and flowers in the dark means that the environment is one in which rest is appropriate, that the chemistry of the night-blooming and night-active plant world is a kind of confirmation, soft, continuous, requiring nothing in return, that the dark is not something to be managed or survived, but simply inhabited. inhabited the way a plant inhabits the soil it grows in, without urgency, without resistance, simply present in the place where it finds itself, drawing what it needs from what is around it, releasing what it produces into the air, following its own rhythm in the particular way that only it follows its rhythm, unrepeatable and ordinary and quietly extraordinary at the same time. There is a point in the descent towards sleep when thought becomes permeable. Researchers who study hypnagogia, the transitional state between wakefulness and sleep, describe it as a period of unusual mental activity in which the ordinary boundaries between perception and imagination begin to soften. Images arise that are not quite memories and not quite dreams. Sounds seem to carry meanings that dissolve before they can be grasped. The mind makes connections that it would not make in full wakefulness, following associative paths that bypass the usual gatekeeping of logic and sequence. Some researchers believe that this transitional state may play a role in creative processing, that the loosening of ordinary mental constraints allows certain kinds of problem-solving and pattern recognition that the fully awake brain suppresses in the interest of efficiency. But it is also simply a beautiful state. The mind at the edge of sleep has a quality that is difficult to describe in language designed for the fully awake, a quality of spaciousness, of gentle surprise, of being interested in things without needing to understand them. Thoughts arrive and pass without being held. Images appear and fade without being followed. The ordinary effort of keeping track of oneself softens until there is not much to keep track of, and what remains does not seem to require tracking. This is the state that all of tonight's chemistry has been moving toward. Not producing it, the brain produces it on its own, given the right conditions, but clearing the way for it, reducing the interference, quieting the background processes that keep the mind at a slight distance from its own natural tendency to let go. The lavender in the air, if there is any, the residue of the chamomile still moving through the bloodstream in ways too gentle to feel. The parasympathetic shift that happened gradually across the evening, measurable now in the variability of a slower heartbeat, in the slightly cooler temperature of the skin, in the easier rhythm of the breath. All of it working together, and none of it requiring acknowledgement to continue working. The plants do not need to be thanked. They are doing what they do, regardless, in gardens and fields and forest floors and small clay pots on windowsills all over the world tonight, producing their chemistry in the dark, following their rhythms, maintaining their slow and patient presence in the same night that is moving through you now. You are part of the same night they are part of, the same dark, the same quiet, the same planetary turning that will bring in its own time, and without any assistance from you, the light. There is nothing to hold on to here, and nothing that needs to be held. The glymphatic fluid is already beginning its work, moving through the spaces between things, clearing what the day left behind. The slow waves are already gathering at the edges of awareness, waiting with the patience of something that has never needed to hurry because it has always arrived. Somewhere outside in the dark, something is growing, slowly, without effort, in the direction it has always been growing. And here, in the quiet of this particular moment, in the warmth of a body that knows more about rest than the mind has ever been asked to understand, there is only this: the breath, the dark, the plants in the world doing what they do, and the gentle, unhurried, completely reliable fact of sleep. Coming now, the way it always comes, when there is nothing left to do but let it.